The judge glared down from the bench and said firmly, "You will stand when speaking to this court, or you'll be held in contempt." The courtroom fell completely silent. Then, with great effort, a disabled royal guard began to rise. One hand gripped his cane for balance, the other trembled from the strain. Every movement was slow and painful, but when he finally spoke, his words struck a chord so deep, the entire courtroom was left in tears, even the judge. What did he say that moved the room to silence and brought seasoned officers to tears? Before we reveal that emotional moment, be sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The sound of Judge Marcus Pryor's gavel, striking its wooden block, reverberated through the packed courtroom like thunder on a clear day. Every conversation ceased, every whisper died, every rustle of paper stopped, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. This was Courtroom 7 at Westminster Magistrates Court, where Judge Pryor had built his reputation on unwavering adherence to tradition and protocol. Over the past 2 decades, in the witness stand sat a figure that commanded attention even in silence. Sergeant Nathaniel Dre, 34 years of age, wore his Royal Guard dress uniform with the precision of a man for whom every detail mattered. The scarlet tunic bore the weight of multiple service medals, each one a story of dedication that few civilians could truly comprehend. Yet beneath the polished brass and pristine fabric lay a reality that had fundamentally altered not just his life, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The wheelchair had become his constant companion 6 months prior, though he wore it with the same dignity he brought to everything else in his military career. Chrome spokes gleamed under the harsh courtroom lighting, and the rubber wheels sat motionless on the hardwood floor as he faced the bench. With the same unwavering posture that had once made him a model guardsman, the case bringing them all together seemed almost anticlimactic given the drama that was about to unfold. Marcus Whitley, a 38-year-old man with the hollow cheeks and shaking hands of someone intimately acquainted with addiction, sat in the defendant's dock facing charges of armed robbery. Just 3 weeks earlier, he had cornered 73-year-old Eleanor Thorne outside a Westminster grocery store, pressing a blade against her ribs while demanding her purse. It should have been a straightforward proceeding: victim testimony, security footage, swift justice. But nothing about this day would prove straightforward. Judge Pryor adjusted his spectacles and leaned forward with the authority of someone who had never questioned his own methods. His voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. "Sergeant Dre, court protocol requires all witnesses to rise when addressing this bench. You will stand immediately, or face contempt charges." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between medieval knights. Every person present understood the absurdity of the demand, yet none dared speak. This was Pryor's domain, where his word carried the weight of absolute law. Prosecutor James Hartwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier warnings about Dre's condition having been dismissed with Pryor's characteristic wave of indifference. "The law makes no exceptions for personal inconvenience, Mr. Hartwell," had been the judge's response during their pretrial conference. From the gallery, retired Colonel William Hayes felt his blood pressure rising as he witnessed the confrontation developing before his eyes. He had served with Dre's father in the brutal campaigns of the Falkland Islands, had watched young Nathaniel transform from a boy obsessed with toy soldiers into a man who embodied the finest traditions of British military service. What was unfolding seemed like a betrayal of everything that service represented. When Sergeant Dre finally responded, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced far greater challenges than an inflexible judge. "Your Honor, I am physically unable to stand. However, I would respectfully suggest that my inability to use my legs has never prevented me from standing for the principles this court represents." The response sent a visible shockwave through the assembled crowd. Judge Pryor's face flushed crimson, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his gavel. In 30 years of presiding over legal proceedings, no witness had ever challenged his authority with such calm defiance. The temperature in the room seemed to rise several degrees as Judge Pryor struggled to process what had just occurred. His entire judicial philosophy rested on the foundation of unquestioned respect for court procedures, and this soft-spoken challenge threatened to undermine everything he believed about maintaining order and authority. "Sergeant Dre," Pryor's voice carried a dangerous edge, "your medical circumstances, however unfortunate, do not excuse disrespect toward this court's established traditions. I will give you one final opportunity to demonstrate proper courtroom behavior." The response came without hesitation. though it carried undertones that made several jury members lean forward in their seats. "Your Honor, perhaps I might explain to this court precisely why standing is no longer possible for me, and whether that truly affects my ability to show respect for justice." The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Protocol demanded that Pryor shut down such theatrical appeals to emotion, but something in Drew's eyes, a depth of pain that transcended mere physical suffering, gave him unexpected pause. "Proceed, Sergeant, but understand that this court will not be swayed by attempts at manipulation through sympathy." Dre nodded with the same crisp acknowledgement he had given superior officers throughout his military career. 6 months ago, I was completing my regular patrol circuit around Buckingham Palace. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and clear, with the usual collection of tourists gathering to photograph the guards and watch our ceremonial duties. His voice took on the measured cadence of someone recounting events that had been replayed in his mind countless times. I had just finished inspecting the security barriers when screaming erupted from the direction of St. James's Park. Not the excited shrieks of children at play, but something primal, the sound of genuine terror. Eleanor Thorne, seated in the front row of the gallery, gripped her recovered handbag more tightly as she listened. She had insisted on attending every session of the trial, driven by a need to see justice served for the man who had risked everything to protect her. I ran toward the commotion and discovered a scene that still haunts my dreams. Dre continued, his gaze growing distant. A man in the grip of what appeared to be a severe psychological episode had cornered a group of school children from St. Margaret's Primary School, 7-year-olds on an educational visit to see where the monarch lived, now trapped against a park fence by someone wielding a kitchen knife. The prosecutor wanted to object to the apparent irrelevance, but the absolute silence in the courtroom suggested that everyone present understood they were witnessing something far more significant than routine testimony. Their teacher, Miss Sarah Phillips, was attempting to shield her students with her own body, but she barely reached 5 feet in height and was clearly terrified beyond rational thought. The attacker was screaming about voices only he could hear, advancing on those children with the knife trembling in his grip, and I realized with absolute clarity that seconds would determine whether 7 innocent lives would be lost. Judge Pryor found himself leaning forward despite his intention to maintain judicial distance. The clinical detachment he prided himself on was cracking in the face of Drew's quietly compelling narrative. I didn't consider protocol or proper procedure or backup rival times. I simply ran toward that knife-wielding man and tackled him with every ounce of strength I possessed. The courtroom had become so silent that the hum of fluorescent lighting seemed to echo like distant thunder. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys as she absorbed testimony unlike anything she had encountered in 15 years of recording legal proceedings. Dre rolled up his left sleeve, revealing scar tissue that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow in jagged pink lines. "The blade found me here first," he indicated the largest scar. "Then here." His hand moved to his shoulder, and finally here. He gestured toward his lower back. But the wound that changed everything came when he drove the knife into my spine. As I was trying to restrain him, the silence deepened, if such a thing were possible. Several jury members were openly weeping, while others stared with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident. There was a moment, perhaps a second, perhaps an eternity, when everything went completely quiet. No screaming, no struggling, nothing but a silence so profound it felt like being underwater. Then pain unlike anything I had ever imagined possible exploded through my nervous system. Drew's voice remained steady, but his knuckles had gone white where they gripped his wheelchair's armrests. "But do you know what occupied my thoughts during those first seconds of paralysis, Your Honor? I was remembering my father, Staff Sergeant William Dre, who died serving in Afghanistan when I was barely 16 years old. He used to tell me that courage isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time you do fall." Lying on that pavement, feeling warmth spreading down my legs before I realized it was my own blood, I understood for the first time that getting back up isn't always about using your own defeat. Marcus Whitley had gone completely pale in the defendant's dock. His court-appointed attorney was scribbling notes with shaking hands, while Whitley himself stared at Dre with an expression somewhere between horror and growing comprehension. The paramedics reached us in under 4 minutes, excellent response time by any measure. But when you're lying paralyzed on concrete pavement, watching your blood pool around 7 terrified children, for minutes stretches into something approaching eternity, The medical team kept asking standard questions: my name, the date, whether I could feel sensation in my extremities. I kept asking about the children's well-being, whether anyone had checked Miss Phillips for injuries, whether the attacker was properly restrained. In the gallery, Colonel Hayes felt tears threatening for the first time since his wife's funeral 3 years earlier. This was the boy he had watched grow into manhood, the son of his dearest friend, embodying everything that military service was supposed to represent. The emergency surgery lasted 14 hours. Drew's voice grew stronger as he continued. When consciousness finally returned, my commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, was maintaining vigil beside my hospital bed. His first words were to assure me that all 7 children were safe and uninjured. His second communication was the medical team's assessment that I would never walk again. Dr. Amanda Chen, who had supervised Drew's emergency treatment at St. Mary's Hospital, would later describe to journalists how unusual his case had been. In 12 years of emergency medicine, I've treated thousands of trauma victims, but I've never encountered someone more concerned about other people's welfare than their own catastrophic injuries. He was asking about those children before we had stabilized his vital signs. Drew's testimony continued with the same measured precision. Colonel Morrison's third piece of information concerned the attacker's identity. David Brennan, age 42, with an extensive history of untreated mental illness. He had been cycling in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, and on the day he threatened those children, he had been without medication for 3 weeks because he lacked funds to purchase it. Judge Pryor shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this testimony was venturing into territory he preferred to avoid: the systemic failures that created many of the criminals who appeared in his courtroom. I spent the following 3 months learning to navigate existence from a wheelchair, how to transfer between bed and chair, how to manage stairs and curbs and doorways that suddenly seemed designed to exclude people like me, how to dress in this uniform. He gestured to his scarlet tunic, using only hands to compensate for everything my legs could no longer provide. The jury was completely absorbed in his account. Several members were crying openly, but Dre seemed oblivious to their emotional responses, lost in recounting those dark months of adjustment. But the most difficult aspect wasn't adapting to physical limitations. It was the letter that arrived during my 3rd day of rehabilitation therapy. From an inner jacket pocket, Dre produced an envelope worn soft from countless readings. The paper showed the creases and stains of something treasured beyond measure. It came from the children, all 7 of them, along with Miss Phillips and several parents. Would the court like to know what they wrote to me? Judge Pryor nodded, no longer trusting his voice to remain steady. Thank you, Mr. Soldier, for keeping us safe. We made drawings of you as a superhero because that's what you are to us. Love from everyone in class to be. Drew's composure finally cracked slightly. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez drew a picture of me in this red uniform, with a cape flowing behind me, standing with arms outstretched to protect them. Standing, Your Honor. Even though she had witnessed me fall, even though she knew I was seriously injured, in her mind I remained standing. The impact of those words hit the courtroom like a physical force. In the jury box, retired educator Margaret Holmes was sobbing without restraint, her hand pressed against her mouth. For decades of teaching primary school children had given her nightmares about scenarios exactly like what Dre had faced. The emotional weight of Drew's testimony had transformed the sterile courtroom into something resembling a cathedral, where ordinary legal proceedings had given way to something approaching the sacred. Judge Pryor found himself studying the man before him with completely new understanding, seeing not a disabled individual requiring accommodation, but the living embodiment of sacrifice and service. The medical professionals informed me that my career with the Royal Guard had reached its conclusion. Dre continued, his military bearing gradually reasserting itself. They suggested I should consider myself fortunate to have survived, that I should investigate disability benefits and early retirement options. But they failed to comprehend something fundamental about the nature of service. His posture straightened even further, transforming him into the perfect image of military precision despite the wheelchair. The Royal Guard doesn't exist because we can march in formation or provide impressive displays for tourists. We exist to protect others, to serve something greater than ourselves, to stand in every sense of that word between danger and those who cannot defend themselves. The day I put on this uniform again after my injury, I finally understood that I had never been more qualified to wear it. Judge Pryor studied the medals adorning Drew's chest with new appreciation. The military cross, the Distinguished Service Order, ribbons representing deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and most prominently, the George Cross awarded for extraordinary acts of bravery in circumstances of extreme danger, which brings us to the events that occurred 3 weeks ago, Dre said, his attention finally shifting to Marcus Whitley in the defendant's dock. I was performing security duties outside Westminster Abbey when I observed Mr. Whitley approaching Mrs. Thorne. Even from a distance of 50 yards, I could recognize the predatory body language, could see the fear beginning to register in her expression. Eleanor Thorne nodded emphatically, her weathered hands clutching the same handbag that had been the object of Whitley's attention. I immediately radioed for backup and began moving toward them. Though my wheelchair's maximum speed on cobblestone surfaces is considerably less than what my legs could once achieve, by the time I reached their location, Mr. Whitley had Mrs. Thorne pressed against a wall, demanding her possessions while holding a blade to her throat. She was weeping, pleading with him not to hurt her, offering him everything she carried. Prosecutor James Hartwell had prepared extensively for this testimony, but hearing it delivered with such quiet intensity still sent chills through his entire body. When Mr. Whitley noticed my approach, his reaction was to laugh, actual laughter. His exact words were, "What's the cripple in the fancy dress-up costume going to do? Call his mommy for help." His jaw muscles tensed visibly. I identified myself as a serving member of Her Majesty's Royal Guard, informed him that he was under arrest, and directed him to step away from Mrs. Thorne immediately. The memory of that confrontation played behind her eyes like scenes from a film he had watched too many times. Mr. Whitley's response was to press his blade more firmly against Mrs. Thorne's neck. He informed me that if I moved any closer, he would slice the old woman open like a Christmas goose. Those were his precise words, Your Honor. In the defendant's dock, Marcus Whitley had gone ashen. His attorney was taking frantic notes, but both knew that Westminster Abbey's extensive security camera system had recorded every moment of the encounter in high definition. I have received training in crisis negotiation, de-escalation techniques, and all standard protocols for hostage situations, but no training manual addresses how to maintain authority when the perpetrator views you as subhuman because of physical disability. Judge Pryor winced at the bluntness of the observation. I attempted to reason with him. I explained that Mrs. Thorne was someone's grandmother, that she had done nothing to deserve his threats. I offered to take her place as a hostage, suggested that a member of the Royal Guard would be worth more to him than an elderly pensioner could ever be. His response was to spit directly in my face. The silence in the courtroom had become so complete that the sound of breathing seemed amplified. That was when Mrs. Thorne demonstrated remarkable courage. Her voice softened with genuine admiration. She looked Mr. Whitley directly in the eye and said, "Young man, that soldier has already sacrificed more for this country than you'll ever understand. If you need to hurt someone, hurt me and leave him be." Eleanor Thorne straightened in her seat, her chin raised with the same defiance she had displayed that day. Mr. Whitley's answer was to strike her across the face, with sufficient force to knock her to the pavement, and that, Your Honor, was the moment I stopped being a negotiator and returned to being a soldier. The change in Dr's voice was subtle, but unmistakable, the measured tones of legal testimony replaced by something harder, more dangerous. I drove my wheelchair directly into Mr. Whitley's legs, using momentum and the chair's weight to destabilize his balance. As he fell backward, I seized his wrist, the one controlling the knife, and applied a joint manipulation technique from my close combat training. The blade scattered across the cobblestones, and Mr. Whitley found himself face down on the pavement, with a cripple in fancy dress applying pressure to nerve clusters that would have produced screaming if he'd possessed sufficient breath. Several jurors were nodding with obvious approval. In the gallery, Colonel Hayes was grinning with fierce pride at the tactical precision of Dr's response. Backup personnel arrived. Within 2 minutes, Mr. Whitley was taken into custody without additional incident. Mrs. Thorne received treatment for minor injuries and was released. I completed my incident report, expecting this to be simply another case in another day of service to the Crown. Dre paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the entire courtroom before returning to Judge Pryor. "Yet here we are, Your Honor, with you demanding that I stand to demonstrate respect for this court. You want me to rise to give testimony about protecting an innocent woman from a career criminal who believed my disability rendered me powerless. You require me to stand to show the respect I hold for the law and the justice system I have sworn to defend. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now, and Judge Pryor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, waiting to see how he would respond. So permit me to pose a question, Your Honor. When I threw myself at that knife-wielding maniac to protect 7 children, was I standing? When I endured 14 hours of surgery to preserve my life, was I standing? When I learned to function with paralysis so I could continue serving my nation, was I standing? When I risked my life 3 weeks ago to defend Mrs. Thorne, was I standing? Each question struck like artillery shells finding their target. Judge Pryor discovered he was gripping his gavel with such force that his knuckles had turned bone white. Because if your definition of standing requires functional legs, then I suppose I was not. But if your definition encompasses facing danger without hesitation, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and serving ideals greater than personal comfort regardless of cost, then, Your Honor, I have not stopped standing since the day I first put on this uniform. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. In the jury box, former police officer David Martinez was weeping openly, his shoulders shaking with emotion. In the gallery, a mother who had lost her son in Afghanistan rose to her feet, tears streaming down her cheeks. Then another person stood, and another, like ripples spreading across still water. The entire courtroom rose to their feet, everyone except the man who had inspired them to stand. Even the court reporter was standing, her machine forgotten. Marcus Whitley looked around in bewilderment as 300 people paid silent tribute to a man who embodied everything he had never understood about honor, sacrifice, and service to others. Judge Pryor stared at the unprecedented scene before him, his throat constricted with emotions he rarely permitted himself to experience. In 3 decades on the bench, he had never witnessed anything comparable. The majesty of law had always been about precedent and procedure, the mechanical application of justice without sentiment. But seated before him was a man who represented justice in its purest form, not the cold process of legal machinery, but the moral imperative to protect innocence and serve the greater good. Sergeant Dre. Judge Pryor's voice was thick with emotion he could no longer suppress. This court acknowledges that some forms of standing transcend mere physical capability. The judge's words settled over the courtroom like benediction, sacred and transformative. In the defendant's dock, Marcus Whitley had buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been shame or calculation or simply the overwhelming weight of witnessing genuine heroism. Your Honor, Dre said quietly, with the court's permission, I have one additional item to present. Judge Pryor nodded, having abandoned all pretense of caring about procedural technicalities. From yet another pocket, Dre produced a photograph, its edges softened from handling. He passed it to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Pryor's bench. The judge's hands trembled as he held it up to examine it properly. The photograph showed 7 children in school uniforms, their small arms wrapped around a tall man in royal guard ceremonial dress. The man was standing upright, proud, unmarked by the scars that would later define his existence. At the photograph's bottom, in careful childish penmanship, someone had written, Our hero, Mr. Soldier Dre. Thank you for keeping us safe. We love you lots. That picture was taken 3 days before the attack, Dre explained. The children from St. Margaret's Primary had won a competition to meet an actual royal guard. I spent 2 hours with them that afternoon, answering their endless questions, allowing them to try on my bearskin hat, teaching them about honor and duty, and what it means to protect others. Judge Pryor found himself studying each small face in the photograph, attempting to imagine the terror they must have experienced, the confusion of seeing their hero fall. Following my injury, those same children initiated a letter-writing campaign. Every week for 6 months, I received cards and artwork and messages of encouragement. They organized fundraising activities for my medical expenses, bake sales, and car washes. 7-year-olds, Your Honor, working to assist a soldier they barely knew because they understood something that many adults seemed to have forgotten. Dre's voice grew stronger, more resonant with conviction. They understood that heroes don't become heroes because nothing bad ever happens to them. Heroes become heroes because when terrible things occur, they stand up anyway. They stand for others. They stand for what's right. They stand even when, especially when standing costs them everything they thought they needed. In the gallery, Miss Sarah Phillips was sobbing without restraint. She had requested leave from St. Margaret's Primary specifically to attend this trial, to support the man who had saved her students at such tremendous personal cost. Emma Rodriguez, the child who drew me as a superhero, sent me another picture last month. Would you care to see it, Your Honor? Before Judge Pryor could respond, Dre produced another piece of paper. This one clearly recent. The drawing depicted a figure in red uniform seated in a wheelchair. But rather than appearing diminished, the figure seemed to radiate strength and authority. Around him stood other figures, children, adults, all gazing up at him with expressions of admiration and love. Emma wrote on the back, Mr. Soldier Dre, you're still our superhero. Wheels or legs doesn't matter. What matters is your heart. She's 8 years old now, Your Honor, and she comprehends something about heroism that apparently eludes some adults. Judge Pryor's hands shook as he examined the child's artwork. In 30 years of presiding over criminal proceedings, he had witnessed humanity at its worst, an endless parade of victims and perpetrators, broken lives and shattered dreams that comprised the daily reality of the justice system. But he had rarely seen humanity at its best, and never with such clarity and simple, profound truth. The law exists to stand up for what's right, Dre continued, his voice building with passionate conviction. It's about protecting those who cannot protect themselves, ensuring that justice prevails over chaos, that good triumphs over evil. Every day I put on this uniform, I stand up for those principles. Every time I patrol these streets, I stand up for the values this nation was built upon. When I confronted Mr. Whitley 3 weeks ago, I stood up for Mrs. Thorne and for every other innocent person who might cross his path in the future. Marcus Whitley's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in her client's ear, but Whitley shook his head violently, his eyes fixed on Dre with an expression of growing recognition and comprehension. Your Honor, you may demand that I rise from this chair, but you cannot make me stand any taller than I already do. You may hold me in contempt for failing to follow your procedures, but you cannot make me feel contempt for the principles that placed me in this chair. You may question my respect for this court, but you cannot question my respect for justice itself. The words struck Judge Pryor like physical blows. In his mind, he could see the entire arc of his judicial career, the thousands of defendants he had sentenced, the rigid adherence to protocol he had always prized, the cold efficiency with which he had dispensed justice without ever truly understanding what justice meant. I have given everything I have to give in service of this country and its people, Dre said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the courtroom. I have given my mobility, my independence, my dreams of the future I thought I would have, but I have never surrendered my dignity, and I never will, not to a criminal with a knife, not to a system that values procedure over principle, and not to anyone who mistakes reasonable accommodation for weakness. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Judge Pryor stared down at Sergeant Dre, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a disabled man requiring special consideration, but as the living embodiment of everything the law was supposed to protect and serve. The uniform, the medals, the wheelchair, they were all symbols of sacrifice made manifest, of principles lived rather than merely recited. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Pryor rose from his elevated bench. Then, in a gesture that would be remembered and discussed long after his retirement, he stepped down from his position of authority and walked to where Dre sat. Without speaking, he extended his hand. Dre clasped it firmly, their eyes meeting in a moment of perfect understanding and mutual respect. Sergeant Dre, Judge Pryor's voice was thick with emotion he could no longer contain. This court stands corrected. You have demonstrated more genuine respect for justice in the past hour than I have witnessed in 30 years on this bench. Your testimony is accepted with gratitude, and your service to this nation is acknowledged with the deepest possible appreciation. From the defendant's dock came an unexpected sound. Marcus Whitley was crying, not the manipulative tears of someone seeking sympathy, but deep, wrenching sobs of a man finally confronting the magnitude of his own moral failure. Your Honor, Whitley's voice was barely audible above his weeping. I need to change my plea. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps of surprise. Public Defender Sarah Morrison attempted to silence her client, but Whitley pushed her away. With surprising force, I want to plead guilty, he said, his voice growing stronger. To all charges, every single one. I don't want a trial anymore. I don't deserve one. Judge Pryor looked between Whitley and Dre, recognizing that something profound had just occurred in his courtroom. Mr. Whitley, you have constitutional rights, the right to counsel, the right to a fair trial. I waive all my rights. Whitley interrupted firmly. I waive everything. I'm guilty, Your Honor. Guilty of robbery. Guilty of assault. Guilty of being the kind of person who would threaten a grandmother and mock a war hero. I'm guilty of everything, and I want to pay for what I've done. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that the courtroom remained in stunned silence. This was not the calculated plea bargain of a career criminal, but something resembling genuine contrition. Furthermore, Whitley continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, I want to apologize to Mrs. Thorne for terrorizing her, to Sergeant Dre for my inexcusable behavior, and to this court for wasting everyone's time with my pathetic excuses. He turned in his seat to face Dre directly. I don't expect forgiveness, Sergeant. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that what you did not just in protecting Mrs. Thorne, but in showing me what a real man looks like, it's changed something in me. I don't know if I can ever be worthy of the sacrifice you've made, but I'm going to try. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Even his attorney was staring at him in amazement, having never witnessed such a complete reversal in a client's demeanor. Judge Pryor found himself in uncharted territory. In 3 decades of criminal proceedings, he had never seen a defendant so completely transformed by witnessing genuine heroism and moral courage. Mr. Whitley, Judge Pryor said carefully, if you are certain of this decision, the court will accept your guilty plea. However, given the unusual circumstances, I'm ordering a psychological evaluation to ensure you're making this choice with full understanding of the consequences. I understand completely, Your Honor. For the first time in my life, I understand what I've been and what I need to become. 4 hours after the gavel had first fallen, Courtroom 7 was nearly empty except for a small group gathered around Sergeant Dre. Eleanor Thorne sat beside his wheelchair, her weathered hand resting gently on his arm, tears of gratitude still flowing down her cheeks. Colonel Hayes stood at attention nearby, his chest swelled with pride for the young man who had exceeded even his highest expectations of what military service could represent. Judge Pryor approached the group slowly, having exchanged his judicial robes for a simple civilian suit, his authority transformed into humility and newfound wisdom. Sergeant, he said quietly, I owe you more than an apology. I've spent so many years focused on the letter of the law that I completely lost sight of its spirit. You reminded me today why I became a judge in the first place, to serve justice, not just procedure. Dre looked up at him with compassion rather than anger or triumph. Your Honor, we all lose our way sometimes. What matters is finding the courage to change course when we realize we've taken a wrong turn. Outside the courthouse, media representatives from across the nation waited in growing numbers. News of what had transpired in Courtroom 7 had begun to spread through social media and news networks, and reporters were eager to interview the Royal Guard, who had redefined what it meant to stand for justice. But Sergeant Nathaniel Dre had one final obligation before facing the cameras and microphones. In a small classroom at St. Margaret's Primary School, 7 children, now 8 years old and slightly taller, were waiting to welcome home their hero, not because he could walk, but because he had never stopped standing for everything they believed about goodness and courage. As his wheelchair moved through the school's familiar corridors, past drawings and posters celebrating bravery and kindness, Dre reflected on the day's extraordinary events. He had entered that courtroom as a witness in what seemed like a routine robbery case. He was leaving as something far more significant, a symbol of the truth that heroism isn't defined by what happens to you, but by how you choose to respond to what happens to you. Marcus Whitley would eventually receive a sentence of 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 7. More importantly, he began the long, difficult process of rehabilitation and redemption, inspired by the example of a man who had transformed his greatest loss into his greatest strength. The case would be studied in law schools for generations to come, not for its legal precedents, but for its demonstration of justice as a living, breathing principle rather than mere procedural exercise. In a classroom filled with children's laughter and the warm afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, a man in a wheelchair sat surrounded by 8-year-olds who understood that the truest form of standing up has absolutely nothing to do with legs and everything to do with heart, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. The story of Sergeant Nathaniel Dre became a powerful reminder that heroes are not defined by their physical limitations, but by their determination to transcend those limitations in service of something greater than themselves. In a world that often confuses strength with invulnerability, his example demonstrated that real strength comes from the courage to continue serving, even when service costs everything you thought you needed to succeed. He had stood in that courtroom, not with his legs, but with his spirit, his convictions, and his unwavering commitment to justice. And in doing so, He had inspired everyone around him to stand a little taller, to serve a little better, and to remember that true heroism is measured, not by what we have, but by what we're willing to give.